If anime original ending happens, you're all 200 IQ geniuses, but if it doesn't, you're the—
No! It means the anime was failed of its potential.
We were right. It all made sense. Almost every single theory related to anime original ending makes perfect sense. It's the most fitting ending to Attack on Titan. We were not wrong. It was them. Anime original ending has already been confirmed. I don't look at the sub for a few hours, and when I come back, people are dooming over the fact that Paolo saw bits from 139. It's almost as if people forgot the fundamentals of anime original ending. We are going to see bits from 139. We need to see the manga timeline for anime original ending to work. Our battle is almost over! Here's a little art piece I've made to represent our will for the anime original ending! There has been too much hope for it to be thrown away. Will the possibility of anime original ending into existence with your hope keep moving forward? The end is never the end. 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 My Hope Chad brothers, Susume! My fellow Hope Chads, scream! My fellow Hope Chads, rage! My fellow Hope Chads, In 2019, a small enclave of the Attack on Titan fandom took its first steps towards a toxic mess of bigoted memes, political extremism, and conspiratorial thinking so detached from reality that it makes some flat earthers seem reasonable. The worst of this group gathered on r/Jaegerbomb, a subreddit which has since been banned in 2022 for community violations. But the ideology that birthed Jaegerbomb never really went away, and it is still alive today, particularly in the sections of this community that were invested in conspiracy theories. Don't bother asking me how I know. Just screenshot this and move along. There's going to be a chapter 140. It'll be announced as a surprise in parallel with an unforeseen future event that wasn't seen through paths. Mikasa's dream is the first timeline. Manga is the second timeline, starting from the end of Mikasa's dream. The anime is the third timeline, starting from a vision of the second timeline's current destruction. The movie, or fourth and final timeline, starts from chapter 140 and is the true ending. That little clip I read you was probably nonsensical if you never watched Attack on Titan, but I can assure you it makes even less sense if you have watched it. Spoiler warning, but Attack on Titan is a time travel show, but it is very clearly a closed time loop. The idea of multiple timelines is nowhere to be found in the text, except through wild games of strained syllogisms that sound like they came from a parody of a 9/11 truther. I plan on helping you understand these posts. I want you to understand them because I think in some way it is important to understand, but that will take quite a journey, and the journey starts with the Plot Chads, a sketchy group of Attack on Titan fans with very suspect ideas about its plot, so we should probably start there, with the plot of Attack on Titan, for the sake of the uninitiated. Attack on Titan, also known as Shingeki no Kyojin, also known as AOT or SNK, is a very long story with a lot of twists and turns, and you don't need to know all of them, but you should probably know the basics, just so that nothing catches you off guard, so here are the basics. Humanity has all but been wiped out by Titans, a race of monsters somewhere between zombie and kaiju. What remains of humanity exists within 3 concentric walls, and then the outermost wall breaks. This leads to an immense amount of social and political instability as the total landmass humanity has to work with gets cut in half. At the center of this is Eren Yeager, a boy whose mom got eaten by a Titan when the wall first broke down. He joins the military so that he can become a member of the Survey Corps, the military branch focused on venturing outside the walls and into Titan territory. This is in part because he's always idolized them, and in part because Eren's father is implied to know secrets about the history of Titans, and he keeps said information in his basement, and said basement is currently in Titan-infested territory. Eren joins the Survey Corps, and they go on expeditions to uncover the basement. Along the way, it is revealed that Eren has a superpower that turns him into a Titan temporarily. He's a Titan shifter. Then it's revealed that there are more people with these powers, and not only were they responsible for breaking the wall down, but their plan is to kidnap Eren or wipe out humanity trying. This is because every Titan shifter has a special Titan power, and Eren's is the God power, which will grant him nigh omnipotence if he ever manages to master it. It's pretty obvious at this point in the story that beyond the walls there is some sort of human civilization which these enemy Titan shifters are working for, and who want the Titan god power. Eventually, they make it to the basement and learn that not only are there humans outside the walls, but basically the entire world is fine. We learn that the people in the walls belong to a race known as the Eldians, and that Eldians can be turned into mindless titans or, in limited capacities, intelligent titan shifters such as Eren. They once ruled the world as the Eldian Empire, but a long time ago, one of their kings felt so guilty for his empire sins that he shipped off all of his people to an island that kind of looks like Madagascar, but which is actually called Paradis, wiped their memories with the Titan god power, and erected 3 walls and convinced them that everyone else outside the walls got eaten by Titans. So, good news, humanity isn't at risk of extinction. Bad news, the rest of the world wants to genocide the Eldians on the island so that the Eldian Empire can't rise from the ashes, and that's why the enemy Titan shifters, who work for the mainland nation of Marley, broke down the walls. This is when Attack on Titan went from popular to insanely popular, and it's also where AOT changed from a mystery with horror elements to a geopolitical thriller. What happens next is so complicated and dense that any summary which leaves out the information we don't need to know for this video would end up being impossible to follow, so I'm going to bend the truth and alter things slightly for the sake of clarity. Like, Eren has this super plot-critical antinatalist half-brother, but we're just going to pretend he doesn't exist because I want this video to be watchable. The broad strokes are this. We get a lot of perspectives from Marley, particularly the Eldians who work in their military. Then we see some people from the island try to find a peaceful solution which won't end in war, but they can't. Diplomacy is just not an option right now. So, war starts to break out. During this time, Eren stops being a point-of-view character and eventually becomes an outright antagonist. This reaches a climax where Eren leads a group of ultra-nationalist revolutionaries called the Jaegerists in a violent coup of the island's government, all with the goal of him doing some weird time travel stuff and acquiring the full god power of his Titan Shifter ability, which gives him the strength to unleash a swarm of unstoppable colossal titans on the world in a process called the Rumbling, so that he can wipe out all life beyond the island, thereby ensuring the island's safety. So the story started with us assuming all life beyond the walls was killed by titans, and the climax is the protagonist trying to do just that. It's a very clever, very cute plot twist. So at this point, the fandom is unbelievably hyped. The whole lead up to this moment, from chapter 90, where Eren first played with this idea in an offhand comment, to chapter 123, where he completed his transformation into the bringer of the end times, was unfathomably tight storytelling, with about a dozen disparate story threads all converging into one singular set piece, which itself had been hinted at since around the time season 1 ended, and a lot of people were wondering where it could possibly go from here. Enter the plot chads. There are 3 ways of understanding the plot chads: the easy way, the honest way, and the brutally honest way. Let's start with the easy way. The plot chads were a group of people with strong opinions on where they thought the story was going, and that place was a daring, edgy ending where Eren succeeded in eliminating the world outside the island. The idea for this ending largely stems from a theory called Akatsuki no Requiem, abbreviated to ANR, named after the closing credits theme song for the 4th core of the Attack on Titan anime. The song, performed by Linked Horizon, had a music video released on the Linked Horizon channel, a stop-motion animation in which a fluffy bird egg gets visions of a lizard mourning at a gravestone. The lizard heads back home, where he takes off a mask to reveal he is a bird, the bird egg's future self. He returns home to his loving wife and child. It turns out, though, that this bird has committed quite a few war crimes in his day and is feeling guilty. The bird egg, after seeing this, starts seeing the whole world around it turn to chaos, and there's some stuff with a butterfly. Cool video. Thing is, the person who made this stop-motion animation apparently was told about how the story of Attack on Titan would end, and claims that some of that made it into his music video. In other words, the music video was a coded message about how the story would end. So, the theory goes that Eren would succeed in destroying the world outside of Paradis, go back to his loving wife and child, and looking back on it all, he'd shed a single manly tear. It's not just the music video that convinced them, though. They crunched the numbers, looked at all of the previous chapters, and realized that this ending, if done right, would wrap up basically every remaining thematic thread in the story and make for a really good conclusion. It would be the perfect ending. And so, since Isayama left so many obvious hints that this is where things were going, and because he's too much of a genius not to do something this perfect, this must be where he was going with all of this. They started wrapping other theories into this. For example, Historia got pregnant and, according to them, Eren is absolutely 100% the father. All of this got tied up in the language of knowledge. They knew this is what Attack on Titan was leading up to because they knew what Attack on Titan was about. There were people out there who thought that Attack on Titan wouldn't be properly wrapped up by this incredibly juvenile ending, but those people obviously just didn't read carefully enough. They were speed readers. Of course, the plot chads were wrong. The story didn't end the way they wanted it to. It ended like most people assumed it would, with people from both sides of the story's initial conflict teaming up to stop Eren, and then successfully stopping Eren. The plot chads were incredibly upset and went on to make their own version of the ending, which is decent enough that I don't want to dog on it too hard, but also really isn't the masterpiece they were promising. That is the easy answer of who the plot chads were. Here's the honest version. The plot chads were a bunch of conspiracy theorists with a very slight grasp on reality. We can see the signs of this from day one. Using Akatsuki no Requiem as any kind of predictive tool is fundamentally flawed by the virtue of the fact that it had already successfully predicted things, which sounds like it should give you confidence in it, but it's a spent shell. Like, this tweet was for a music video released in September of 2018, and that music video predicted developments in the story which happened about a year later. The promise that this tweet was making, that the music video would predict something, had already been fulfilled by the time chapter 123 came out. The idea that there was even more for the music video to predict was completely unsubstantiated, let alone that it was a one-to-one parallel with the climax of the story. Sure, he talked in a way that made it seem like he knew the ending, but he got told about the ending. He didn't see manuscripts. He couldn't know every detail because not every detail was even decided on by that point. And even if it was, he had incentive to not give too much away and to be vague with his language, and he was receiving information from someone with the exact same incentive set. To assume that A&R, Akatsuki no Requiem, specifically gave clues about how the final moments of the story would shake out was nothing short of faith. The ending depicted in A&R is also vague and simplistic, so it was inevitable that a more complicated story like Attack on Titan wouldn't fit it too well, so the plot chads needed to flatten some stuff. A key example is that Eren doesn't have a wife and kids to return to, and the closest thing he has to a love interest, Mikasa, wound up being one of the people trying to stop him. Luckily for the plot chads, a woman had mysteriously gotten pregnant about 15 chapters earlier, and it was a character that was already pretty often shipped with Eren. Enter Historia. Historia is a very beloved character. I thought her and Eren was a pretty cute ship for a little while too. They cared a lot about each other, it was cute and all that. In chapter 107, she got mysteriously pregnant at a time that was politically convenient for the Jaegerists, Eren's revolutionary faction, in a way which we won't get into because it involves Eren's antinatalist brother who I said we wouldn't talk about, so the pregnancy was mildly plot important and seemed a bit suspicious. Additionally, the character who was said to be the father was such a no-name character from her backstory that he literally has no name we're aware of. We just call him the farmer. Now, there are no plot holes with this guy being the dad, but it was pretty common to ask questions about who the dad was, since it made trope sense for it to be someone we knew. Eren Historia shippers managed to convince themselves that Eren was the father, and so did the plot chads once A&R theory got popular. The basic thought process went like this. They considered that Eren might be the father because that, if true, would be convenient to either their shipping inclinations or their pet theories about the ending. They therefore made a lot of theories about it, thought a lot about it, and talked a lot about it. Because it was always on their mind, cognitive biases made them consider it an important part of the story and an intentional mystery, rather than just a throwaway plot contrivance explained by mysterious character motivations. Like, they thought the mystery wasn't, why would Historia choose to get pregnant now of all times? They thought the mystery was, who's the daddy? Because this is apparently such a crucial mystery, there's A, no reason the answer would be the obvious red herring they gave us as a teaser, and B, there's no reason the answer would ever be a no-name character. Therefore, it has to be an important character, of which Eren is the only real option, so Eren must be the father. But of course! A lot of weird stuff got wrapped up into the plot chad's understanding of the story. Like, Eren's intentions were something of a mystery. We got an explanation by him. He wants to protect the island where he was born and raised, but we learn over time that there is more to his motivations. But the plot chads need his motivations to remain on the island in general, and his unborn child in specific, which, wasn't going to be the case because it wasn't his child. A big deal was also made about EHF. EMA stands for Eren, Mikasa, Armin, the main trio of the story who were friends since they were kids. EHF stands for Eren, Historia, Flock, who the plot sheds headcanoned as being something of a new trio, based on the fact that Historia was close to Eren and the assumption she was in favor of the genocide plan, plus the fact that Flock, his second in command, was in favor of the genocide plan, and the assumption that he was emotionally close to Eren. This was spoken more through the language of headcanon than knowledge, but it should be understood that these guys were just writing fanfiction. That's what they did and what they were used to. There was no real evidence that the immortal child who makes Titan magic work would be reborn into this world as Historia's kid, but they all just agreed that that was going to happen. As the story progressed and didn't shake out how they wanted, they went into full copium mode. The gist of their theories was that all of the storytelling meant to make the characters trying to stop Eren look heroic was purely a red herring meant to be subverted. That Isayama dedicated over a year of storytelling to building up a heroic ethos that he intended to cut short any chapter now, and that this would obviously be genius storytelling and not a bafflingly paced retread of chapters 3 and 4 specifically. This went all the way to assuming that the penultimate chapter was an illusion conjured by Eren's Titan powers, and once the manga ended in a way they hated, they started cooking up theories about how the anime will end differently, and that this was all an elaborate ruse. That's what we'll be covering in the back end of this video, but for now, a bit more on the plot chads. They gathered their knowledge about the story via the popularity contest of Reddit upvotes, with ideas rising to the top, not based on their validity, but on how good they felt to read. Much of these theories were on how the story would end, and what a good ending would look like, and so the plot chads collectively formed a false idea of what it meant to be a good writer. Like, they thought that if something felt good to read on Reddit, then it would translate to the format of a graphic novel flawlessly, because they thought they enjoyed reading it because they understood what would translate well onto the page. And not only that, they assumed that since they knew what made good writing, and Isayama was a good writer, that they and Isayama must be on the same wavelength. The plot chads were infamous for claiming other people were speed readers. They took great pride in knowing a lot about the story and understanding it like other people didn't, so they got condescending. As a result, when talking about them, it can sometimes be tempting not to stoop to their level, but you cannot understand the plot chads without grappling with the fact that they terribly misread the story and didn't get the point. Like, okay, chapter 126. The contents of this chapter were not crucial to the overall plot, but they were important for getting the gang together so they could all go and stop Eren. The chapter included this 10 out of 10 page, which led to the plot chads referring to the protagonists of the final arc as the Cringe Vengers, a name which I love and personally use, but for none of the reasons they did. A part of this setup chapter included 3 characters, Connie, Falco, and Armin, engaging in some interpersonal drama which mirrors the stuff going on with Eren. Connie is considering causing huge amounts of suffering and death to save a single person close to him, and it is him learning his lesson here that convinces him to help organize the Cringe Vengers so that they could go stop Eren from causing huge amounts of suffering and death to save the people close to him. Now, the fact that this is a parallel is missed on a lot of readers. That's fine, but anyone really trying to analyze every corner of the story so that they can understand it better than anyone else, especially a group which is pathologically obsessed with the idea of parallels, should probably have figured that out. Like, the importance of this side story is really straightforward, but the plot chads, they criticize this chapter for a variety of reasons. It still lives rent-free in their head, but at no point did their theories begin incorporating this incredibly blatant thematic juxtaposition. At no point was this considered a sign or Isayama giving them a hint, because as far as they are concerned, none of it mattered. Like, none of the stuff the protagonists get up to, and none of their motivations, are actually relevant to the story, apparently. This is because, unlike what they claim, they haven't actually analyzed the story and formed a detailed list of all the important thematic elements. They've cherry-picked the thematic elements that are necessary to support the ending they want, and then just pretend that's all there is. The reasons they can justify this to themselves is a bit complicated. So Attack on Titan is a story of dualities. It's very common for ideas like freedom and peace to be juxtaposed by the story as opposing forces, all while the story refuses to say that one takes priority over the other. Like, a classic thing it'll do is have the heroes accomplish something by holding to a certain ideal, only to later meet a villain driven by the same ideal. The heroes are willing to make a small, short-term sacrifice for the hopeful long-term good of the many? Well, guess what? That's what the rest of the world wants to do to your island. It's doing an interesting thing that's not quite both siding the issue, but it's also often not directly taking a side. If I were to put it succinctly, the moral of the story is that easy answers often don't exist. For example, do you trust your comrades or trust yourself? There isn't a way of knowing which one will work out until the dust settles. It's not that one is the correct answer every time, we just cling to that because we need something to drive our decisions. That is, of course, just one reading of it. It's a sentiment echoed within the text, but, well, lots of conflicting sentiments are echoed within the text. The key thing I'm getting at is that Attack on Titan is complicated. It shows earnest depictions of conflicting ideas, and this is the reason many people consider it a smart show. However, if you squint, this ebb and flow of conflicting ideas looks a lot like Subversion. So if you are, let's say, speed reading, you could very easily look at a profound speech given by someone in the story, say, the ideas of this person are the message of Attack on Titan, and then when a conflicting speech is given by a different character with different ideas, you can say, that only exists to be subverted. This is how you get the plot chads ignoring entire sections of the story and still acting like they're the ones who paid the most attention. It's not that they don't realize these parts of the story exist, it's that they think ignoring them is the correct way to read the story, and that if you were paying attention, you'd know that too. To those not in the know, that thing I said about trusting your comrades versus trusting yourself is almost word for word a monologue from season 1 of the anime, and it's a scene that the plot chads actually use to support their ending. See, this was said right before Eren decides to trust his comrades, and then it works out, something good happens. But later that same day, he decides to trust his comrades again, and said comrades get killed as a result when he could have saved them if only he had trusted his own instincts. The plot chads point at that and claim that the overall point of this isn't that you can't know if trusting yourself is a good idea or not, but instead that you should always trust yourself because the really bad thing happened when Eren refused to do that. And this apparently proves that it would be hypocritical of the story to punish Eren for trusting himself over trusting his comrades who are telling him to stop slaughtering people. They take a look at a brilliant scene like this, interpret it as having an incredibly simple and shallow meaning, claim it's a masterpiece anyways, and then use it to justify their incredibly simple and shallow idea for the ending as the only one that would be a masterpiece. Once you realize that the plot chads' analysis is just them flattening the text like this, it's all you can see whenever they open their mouths. Like, when asked why they believe ANR is true, they will give you a laundry list of things that will only make sense if ANR is the canon ending, but the only way that argument tracks at all is if you look at these very broad ideas and abstract parallels in the incredibly specific way that their community trained them to. Like, Historia is definitely meant to parallel the character of Ymir to some extent, so it wouldn't be out of the blue if her story went a similar way to Ymir's story in some regard. The plot chads, by using the ANR music video as a guide, came up with possible ways that Historia's story could, in the future, parallel Ymir's. These ideas were repeated within the community until they became canonical. Now, these somewhat abstract, symbolic parallels between two characters take on, in their minds, a concrete specific meaning. And the plot chads now see that concrete meaning as codified objectively within the text as per Isayama's intentions. Therefore, the only logical conclusion is that Isayama plans for ANR because any ending that is not ANR would by definition contradict the established meaning of these parallels. It's mind-numbing how these people are able to mutilate a story like this. It would be impressive if it wasn't so dumb. This process of taking abstract ideas and giving them specific meanings goes all the way to coming up with specific interpretations of clearly multifaceted or emotional concepts such as freedom, as well as their associated imagery such as flying birds, up to the point that any mention of these ideas within the story or within marketing is taken by some within the community as a wink and a nod towards the select few who understand. It somehow, though, goes even further, because there are some parts of the story they don't just reframe as being very specific in their meaning. Some of this just borders on lying. They hated the final chapter because, of course, they didn't. Their entire community was about how there was one perfect way to end the story, and that ending idea was entirely detached from reality. There were going to be negative emotions no matter how this went down, but because their entire community is about convincing themselves that their strong emotions are rooted in being logically superior to their contemporaries, they had to conclude that the ending was objectively horrendous in quality. Now, there are very real problems with Chapter 139, very fair critiques to make about it, but none of them are scathing enough to match up to the degree to which the chapter made them feel terrible, so they just lied. Because saying something that is at best technically true if you squint, but which matches their emotional truth, is, to them, closer to a true statement than an honest reading of the text that doesn't validate their emotions. The clearest example of this is with regards to Aaron's motivations. Now, Aaron had, on multiple instances, stated what his motivations are, but in the final chapter, he says that he is unclear on his own motivations. It's revealed that he did the rumbling knowing he'd stop, and wanting that to happen because it would result in his friends becoming heroes that the world celebrated, meaning they'd get to live long lives. But he says that even if he didn't know the future, he probably still would have done the rumbling. Why? He doesn't really know. The plot chads called this a retcon. They read this in one of two ways, both of which are dumb for different reasons. The first reading is that this was a retcon by virtue of Aaron forgetting his previously stated motivations. Not only does this ignore that of the 3 moments he stated his motivations, one was in an attempt to manipulate Flock, one was at the very least a lie by omission even by their logic, and the last was him making assumptions about the intentions of his future self. This reading of the ending where Aaron just forgot is pretending that people can't be introspective. Like, oh, there's no shot in hell that Aaron might have, I don't know, been driven by complex subconscious factors that in his final moments he ponders on. I mean, what kind of person would ever dedicate their life to something fueled by emotion and then convince themselves it was pure reason that drove them? Ridiculous. The other reading of this as a retcon is that Isayama is retconning his story by saying Aaron didn't have a motivation. Like, not Aaron forgot, Isayama forgot. There were people who thought the takeaway from this was that we weren't supposed to know what Aaron's motivations were, as if this were the ending of Sword Art Online's first season. This only makes sense if you ignore everything I mentioned above, and if you ignore the flashback Aaron has in the middle of this sentence where his dad tells him some arc words when he's a baby. I wonder if the author is giving us a hint at what Aaron's motivations might have been. But all of this also still ignores that Aaron isn't actually talking about his motivations. He is talking about his vague feelings about what his motivations would be in an alternate version of events that did not happen and which he had not previously commented on because it was just a hypothetical. In reality, he's very clear about his motivations. He did it because he knew he'd get stopped. However, the plot chads based their ending around the assumption that Aaron wasn't planning on being stopped. So when Aaron talked about a hypothetical world where he didn't know he'd be stopped, and he says he's unsure about his motivations in that world the plot chads thought they were living in, they hated it. Thus, they just pretend this was a retconning of the text of the story rather than of their asinine fanfiction. So, yeah. Lying. But that's not all of the BS they get up to with the final chapter. There is a moment in chapter 139 where Aaron, talking to Armin in a dream sequence, has an emotional breakdown and cries about the notion of Mikasa moving on from him and finding a new man, because he loves her and wants her to keep loving him back, to which Armin makes a shocked comment about how pathetic that was. It's comic relief that's also meant to lend clarity into Aaron's mental state, and the plot chads hated it. Even outside of plot chad circles, this scene is widely ridiculed for a composite of 2 reasons. First, because this behavior itself is seen by many as unmanly and worthy of mockery, and second, because it is seen by many as a narrative failure. Some people thought this was a narrative failure because they thought it made Aaron lame, and the plot chads did think this, but they also had a different reason. The plot chads considered this a narrative failure because they thought it retconned Aaron's entire characterization, because they have been routinely lying to themselves and each other about who Aaron is as a character, not just in their wild predictive theories, but also in how they read the text, like the words coming out of his mouth. The moment they cite for Aaron's motivations is chapter 131. Aaron has seen the future, knows he will do the rumbling, and he comes across a kid who he knows will die in the rumbling, who he then monologues at. You see, it's to save the island, it's to save Eldia, but it's more than that. The reality beyond the walls was nothing like the world I dreamed of. When I learned that humanity had survived beyond the walls, I was so disappointed. So I made a wish. I wished for it all to be wiped away. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. From the start of the story, Eren thought that if they killed the Titans, the world would just be this Breath of the Wild style open wilderness for them to frolic through, basically. So, translated, this line essentially reads, "Sure, I want to save my nation, but if I said that was my only motivation, it'd be a lie. A big reason I want to commit genocide is because it would be emotionally convenient for me. Oh my god, I am such a piece of garbage. I'm so sorry." Now, this is very clearly supposed to be Eren reflecting on the fact that he has very childish motivations, which is hammered in by immediately after us cutting to the present, with him engaging in the rumbling and enjoying it, and him being symbolically represented by his child self. And later, in another dream sequence where he says he's not going to stop the rumbling, he's also shown as a child. So, you know, when he goes on a childish tantrum, it kinda makes sense? Eren wants to save his friends, as is shown by the end of the manga, but he also wants the world outside to be perfectly free for him to trample over and exert his will on. He knows it is childish, he knows it is evil, but he lets himself get taken away by that desire anyways. That is what turned him into a villain. He gave up huge amounts of human life, caused an enormous amount of suffering to save the people he couldn't bear to lose, and deal with the fact that there were people out there stopping him from being free, from feeling like nothing was in his way. Eren never really grew up. But to the plot chads, that's not what any of this meant, because they, as a group, are obsessed with the poetic tragedy of doing what has to be done. They see Eren's confession here not as an admission of a character flaw, well, no, they do kind of see it as that, but they see it as a cool character flaw. Like, they see this as Eren refusing to back down from the principle of freedom no matter what, and not as what it is, which is a blatant, despair-fueled admission of weakness. This goes all the way to them trying to scrub away the symbolism of him being a child by insisting that these versions of child Eren we got shown are not actually present-day Eren being depicted symbolically, but are instead past Eren's mind being brought to the future to show him the rumbling and instill in him a desire for freedom. And yes, this is solidified in their custom version of the ending, which is complete with an explicit conversation between this child Eren and adult Eren, clearly depicting them as separate because they are desperate for Eren to not be a man-child who got given ultimate power, but instead a Chad who does what needs to be done, goes home to have barn sex with his hot farmer trad wife, and then shed a single manly tear looking back on the genocide he was forced to commit because he's just deep like that. So, who are the plot chads? The honest answer is that they were a group of fans who all wanted a very specific ending, one which was very unlikely to happen. However, because they were so emotionally attached to this ending, and very susceptible to conspiratorial thought processes, they convinced themselves of countless BS evidences that the ending was inevitable and planned, framing it in terms of objective knowledge, in order to puff up their egos because they're the type of armchair intellectuals who haven't gotten over the teenage fantasy of being a contrarian genius. And all of this begs the question, why did they care so much about the ending? Well, a lot of you have probably pieced it together at this point, but I'll just be brutally honest and go out and say it. They liked the ending because they were rooting for the antagonists. This may be a bold claim, but it's not hard to deduce. In the real ending which they hated, the following things happened. 1. It was revealed that Eren didn't actually believe in the ultranationalist ideology of the Jaegerists. 2. Eren was stopped. 3. Eren being stopped was depicted as a good thing. In their fixed ending, all three of these points changed. Within the lore of A&R, not only does Eren agree with Jaegerist philosophy, not only does he succeed, but we are expected to view this not as a bad thing, but at worst as a bittersweet moment. I discussed how the plot chads flatten the story, taking general thematic ideas and twisting them to mean specific things, and a lot of that is ideological in nature. Like, there is this idea in Attack on Titan about the cycle of violence, and the conflicts between Eldia and the mainland nations are used as a symbol of that broader idea, the idea that violence leads to violence on a population scale. The Eldian Empire conquered the world, then, when it fell, people still hated and feared Eldians, and so that hatred and fear took the form of government-sanctioned military violence against the island, which prompted reciprocal military violence, which then helped stoke existing fears that Eldians would once again try to rule the world, and so on. It is a narrative conflict used to model an aspect of the human condition. For the plot chads, though, the Eldia versus mainland conflict is the cycle of violence. The Jaegerists talk in the story about how the cycle of violence will end if the mainland is destroyed and only Eldia remains, and the plot chads claim that therefore if the genocide plan succeeds, then the cycle of violence will be slain, which would be a moral victory supported by the themes of the text, because, the story goes on about how the cycle of violence is bad, so ending it would be, by the story's own standards, a good thing, so clearly the story is planning on it, right? In order to believe that the story agrees with the Jaegerists is to ignore the fact that this idea is being rebutted within the text by a counterclaim that conflicts are going to continue within the island because conflict is still human nature. And demonstrating this sad reality is indeed one of the purposes of the conflict in chapter 126 and that side story that the plot chads claim is filler. The islanders have nothing to worry about externally anymore, but they still found a way to fight amongst themselves. You could also argue that this is an instance of conflict being stopped not by one side winning, but by forming a compromise peacefully. I could point at chapter 126 and say, hey, this proves the story thinks conflicts can always be solved peacefully. The plot chads could rightfully point to any number of moments in the story which argue against that very thesis, but they won't do that for the even easier to counter claims of the Jaegerists because they agree with the Jaegerists. They think that killing everyone outside the island has, at the very least, genuine ethical arguments in favor of it, and by selectively reading the story, they can claim this not as an opinion, but as knowledge. They aren't telling you what they believe, they're just reciting what the story believes, and they, by the way, really like this story. Once you realize this is why they do what they do, everything snaps into sharp focus. They are obsessed with Eren being this charismatic god emperor who is dedicated to nationalist ideals because they thought it made him likable. It's the same reason they insist that Eren is still the protagonist, because they need some way to justify rooting for him, to justify wanting him to win without admitting that they kind of think he has a point, and by he they don't really mean Eren, because Eren doesn't agree with the Jaegerists. They mean their fanfiction version of Eren who does, because they agree with the Jaegerists, and they like the idea of this ultra-nationalist genocidal coup being led by a charismatic strongman who's doing everything to ensure the existence of Eldian people and a future for his unborn child. There's a lot of talk of what had to be done, Eren's hand being forced, and him doing the logical thing. They don't frame the slaughter of the mainlanders as pretty or even desirable, but they do frame it as to some extent necessary. The idea of a devil, a necessary evil, is often brought up in the story of Attack on Titan in a mixed and multifaceted light, as usual, and this gets flattened by the plot chads to the idea of necessary evils are important because that can be used to justify Eren's actions. If you haven't watched Attack on Titan, this probably sounds bad, but not quite as bad as it actually is. The reason this could sound like it's something kind of sympathetic as a position is because rooting for the villains is often a euphemism for thinking the villains are trying to fight for a worthy cause. Like, if there is a story where a bad guy thinks there are issues with the global economic system and he tries to solve this by firebombing orphanages, and the story ends with the bad guy being stopped but without his concerns being addressed, then someone could say this bad guy had a point as a way of saying that they think we should look into issues with the global economic system. However, our situation here is as if someone said, this bad guy has a point, specifically to advocate for the firebombing of orphanages as a valid form of direct action, because both the Jaegerists and the protagonists had the same goal up until the rumbling happened: protect the island. The only thing that was different was the method. Now, you could potentially still view this sympathetically. Perhaps you think the Jaegerists had a point but took it too far. Yes, genocide is too much, but clearly violence was to some degree necessary, right? I mean, the protagonists are trying to solve everything with diplomacy, but that's just unrealistic. You need to fight back, and the Jaegerists were actually trying to. They just needed moderation. Perhaps a better plan would be to use the rumbling, but only on military institutions and as a mean of deterrent. That would be fighting back, but it would be morally justifiable. The problem is that this plan of only attacking military institutions was the plan of the government that the Jaegerists overthrew. It's not as if the story had two sides, a pacifist side and a genocidal one. It had three. There were the genocidal Jaegerists, the existing government which wanted to do a plan that involved slaughtering countless mainlanders but which mostly spared civilians, and a group of idealists who hoped war could be avoided. But, and this is really important, said idealists were not just willing to go along with the compromise plan in the event that diplomacy failed, but they were already in the process of doing so. The even-handed compromise that acts as the synthesis between two opposing ideas, and which seemed really defensible, was the very thing that the Jaegerists existed to subvert. Due to the fact that it would not absolutely guarantee the survival of the island in the long term, they thought it was unacceptable. And this is why Eren had, according to the plot chads, no other option. There were other options, just not ones they liked, because it's apparently better to put cataclysmic levels of sacrifice on others than comparatively small levels of sacrifice and risk on people you know. Now, I should draw a fine line here. I'm painting something of a platonic ideal of a plot chad, and basically every step it took to get here, there was someone who made it to that point but then dropped out when they realized it was ridiculous, or someone who just likes the idea of an edgy everyone dies ending and was never aware of the incredibly weird undertones of the overall movement. But, you know, the overall movement was not being guided by people who just liked tragic endings. It was being driven by insecure ideologues who can't admit to themselves that they are being influenced by their own ideology. That's a pretty important takeaway from all of this, in my opinion. There's no small amount of validity in wanting to keep politically charged discussions outside of casual fandom experiences, but at a certain point, when someone is openly agreeing with the group of antagonists who meet most academic definitions of fascism, they are the ones who brought politics into this. And while most plot chads were not openly bigoted, a lot were. It was a radicalization pipeline like many others, and the far end of that pipeline was r/Jaegerbomb. Jaegerbomb was an openly far-right subreddit that got banned for hate speech because, you know, it was full of far-right fascists. These were people who felt that r/Titanfolk, the edgy offshoot of the more popular r/Shingeki no Kyojin, wasn't sufficiently edgy enough, and it became the home for all the fans of Attack on Titan who proudly held repugnant political opinions. And it should not surprise you that they were almost exclusively plot chads, and ANR was a common topic of conversation. Just a trigger warning for the rest of this section of the video, just every bigotry, every single one of them. Skip to the end of the chapter if that doesn't feel safe today. These guys were just the absolute most at basically all times. For example, there is a character named Onyankopon in Attack on Titan who is black, and the subreddit started using both his name and a common comedic distortion of his name, Onion Coupon, as a racial slur. They've used both lynching imagery and chattel slavery imagery with intent and discretion, and are generally not afraid to just say incredibly racist stuff at the drop of a hat. Sexism is a particular fixation of theirs as well. Hating on Mikasa is pretty common because everyone here is an ANR theorist and therefore is an Eren Historia shipper, and therefore has beef with Eren Mikasa shippers, and not only do they call her Dog Casa on account of the fact that she's Asian, because she acts like Eren's dog, but also call her Man Casa because she is, to them, not sufficiently feminine. They much prefer Historia, who they consider to be the superior waifu, with her perceived traits of being willing to stay at home raising the kid while not raising a fuss over her husband committing xenophobic war crimes being considered an explicit plus. They're the type of people to use Chad memes post-ironically. This type of meme format is typically used either ironically, as a full-on joke, or pseudo-ironically, as a silly mask for a otherwise genuinely held opinion. With the general premise being that pretending that you think your asinine opinions define masculinity is silly. Jaegerbomb, however, consists of the type of people who genuinely think not only that your opinion on the story of Attack on Titan informs your masculinity, but that being hypermasculine is ubiquitously desirable among men. Honestly, the fact that we started with people who called themselves plot chads was maybe a bit of a red flag. Homophobia and transphobia are obviously a part of all of this, with this particular image having been seared into my retinas. What is important to note is that the only character here that they still like at the time this was made is Flock, who is depicted by the super straight flag, an idea that deserves a bit of a closer analysis because, trust me, this goes somewhere. Super Straight was an anti-trans activism campaign designed with the intention of pointing out imagined hypocrisy with the trans liberation movement. The basic logic went like this. 1. These people will apparently accept anything as a valid identity. 2, we will make up an identity called super straight, which refers to straight people who are so straight that they are unable to be attracted to trans people. 3, when this possession gets called bigoted, we will use their own logic as our shield, claiming that our identity is valid because we say it is. 4, when they don't accept our identity, they can be considered hypocrites, discrediting their movement. An important thing to understand about this whole process is that the type of people who say they are super straight do not believe there is a meaningful distinction between straight people and super straight people. They are not people genuine concerns about how they are distinct from your average heterosexual and who want to be seen for that difference. They are simply pretending that is what they believe because they think doing so can win them an argument against people they don't like, and crucially, they expect to be treated as if they aren't obviously lying, even though they are obviously lying, and think it's funny that they are obviously lying. Not only have they ignored that genital preference is already an accepted concept on the progressive left, but they've constructed a version of their enemy so weird and alien that the term straw man seems insufficient. Like, they are taking a straw man of their opponent's position, all identities are equally valid, and they are treating it like a metaphysical property of their opponent. They are not just claiming that this is what trans activists believe, but think that if it can be proven they don't actually believe it, and that trans activists instead believe something more nuanced, then that would be hypocrisy. And they can do this because they at some point heard a person with blue hair and pronouns say something roughly to that effect and honed in on it as a thing which they could leverage in an argument. They took small, individual parts of a larger picture, claimed it was the standard that all other things in the same category were checked against, and smugly claimed that this intentional, willful lack of nuance and analysis made them intellectually superior. It's the exact same series of cognitive biases and logical fallacies the plot chads used to flatten the story. And so it makes perfect sense that these guys would identify with the super straight argument, because they are detached enough from reality to think it is a legit dunk on the transes. I could go on, but I really don't need to. There is no shortage of evidence showing they hold far-right beliefs, but they also just, admit it. All the time. And the thing is, in spite of this, the less radical plot chads had, and I say this with no small amount of disappointment, mixed views on Jaegerbomb. So, who were the plot chads? They were a bunch of would-be fascist collaborators role-playing as art snobs. That sounds like a terrible accusation, but really it's fairly tame. The Axis powers didn't gain support from their populations because of a bunch of simultaneous gas leaks. While history has made them the villains and therefore boiled them down to cartoonish stereotypes, the truth is that a lot of what they believe, a lot of the philosophical beliefs which they felt justified their atrocities, were not unpopular back then and are not unpopular now. Most people get defensive when you call it for what it is, but when the chips are down, people are willing to make all the same defenses of cruel acts committed now that they were back then. Fascism got popular because it played on deeply human biases and epistemic vices. If fascism were to take root in their country, a lot of these people would make justifications for it, as would a lot of people you know and possibly even care about, because it doesn't come from being intrinsically evil. One of the biggest mistakes these people made is assuming that intelligence and good judgment were character traits, that people who were smart would come to good opinions. What you shouldn't do after learning about them is pat yourself on the back for not being one of the stupid ones. Everyone on Earth makes decisions based on emotion, and then convinces themselves it was rational after the fact. The question isn't if you'll do it, it's if you'll be self-aware enough to catch yourself. None of us are above acting like this, no matter what cause we're fighting for or what our background is. The purpose of learning about people like them is to learn about what we might do if we're not cautious with ourselves. And so, let's learn what they did next. So in the aftermath of the manga's finale, there were a lot of negative emotions flying around. Confusion, grief, disappointment, frustration, and in some cases just full-out rage. There were no shortage of people pseudo-ironically claiming that they'd enact revenge on Isayama by defecating in the bathhouse he planned on running after the manga was over, and lots of people discussed what happened in terms of betrayal. Due to the reveal that Eren was not the fascist strongman they wanted him to be, he quickly became a laughingstock for the entire movement, with them switching to Flock, Eren's second-in-command, as their primary object of worship. Conspiratorial thinking ran amok, with lots of people wondering if Isayama was somehow forced to change the ending by someone, it doesn't matter who. They blamed the editor, they blamed the publisher, they even blamed the audience. Isayama has stated that he originally had an ending idea which was born out of anger, but reconsidered how he wanted the story to end once he saw how attached people became to it. The plot chads assumed that this original ending was ANR and that he got cold feet, despite that not making any sense in the timeline, and it also just not making sense for every other reason imaginable. Like, yeah, Isayama probably had a really juvenile, poorly thought out everyone dies ending in his head at some point early in development, but there is no indication that this was, in any way, ANR. And what really gets me is how they frame this in terms of Isayama's well-being. They claim that they are upset that Isayama did the thing the fanbase wanted, rather than the story he wanted to tell. But in reality, Isayama told the story the best way he could think of, with the audience's feelings being one of the things he weighed. And this small portion of the fanbase is upset because it's not the ending that they wanted. There was no small amount of worshipping Isayama as a messianic figure in the lead up to this, of assuming he was a genius among geniuses for having crafted the perfect, most brilliant plot twist, which they knew he was planning because their entire worldview is 80% confirmation bias by mass. I think my favorite post from this time is this one, which points out all of the ways that mangakas get mistreated by executives within the manga publishing industry, capping it off with the footnote that, in light of all of this, it wouldn't be unlikely for the publisher to have forced Isayama to change the ending, robbing the plot chads of their perfect story. Workers exploited, customers most affected. Of course, they don't see it that way, they see it as them being mad on Isayama's behalf. A lot of people theorize that the ending was quote-unquote bad on purpose because it had too many problems to not be intentional, and this was part of what fueled the fire that kept ANR alive. See, a lot of people felt that this ending wasn't actually the ending. It was all an elaborate ruse by Isayama, who was playing 9-dimensional chess with his audience, I guess. More on that in a bit. The theory was that ANR was going to happen, just not within the manga. The anime of Attack on Titan has had a number of adaptational changes, and this leads them to believe that the anime could potentially have a different ending, even, potentially, ANR. So all that was left was to reverse engineer a situation which would justify such an adaptational decision. This is the anime original ending. AOE. Now, for these guys, AoE can't just be a new ending. It's not enough for it to be an alternative take on the finale, because there are too many things that just don't square with that in their perspective. To the plot chad, the ending of the manga was not just a series of bad decisions that warranted a do-over, but full-on self-contradictory nonsense. It didn't make sense. There had to be an explanation. The conclusion was that the anime isn't an adaptation of the manga. It's a sequel. Their logic is that the story of Attack on Titan is a time travel story of the retry variety. There was a version of events that happened which didn't go Eren's way, so he used Titan magic to change the past and create a new timeline. This second timeline is chronicled in the manga. However, at the end of the manga timeline, things go even worse, so Eren changes the past again to create a third timeline, the anime timeline, which will be different in subtle ways, which lead to an ending that Eren is happy with, which is to say, ANR. In the actual ending of the manga, the Titan powers are removed from the Eldians, and in a post-final chapter epilogue, it's revealed that 100 or so years after the events of the Rumbling, Eldia is destroyed in a war, quote-unquote, proving the Jaegerists right that a full genocide of the outside world was necessary to ensure the future of Eldia. The plot chads hilariously thought that normal readers, who they presumed were obsessed with pacifism and idealism, would hate this, but in reality most people thought that it was a realistic and interesting detail. The AoE theorists thought that this destruction of Eldia was the thing that would spark Eren, who is still apparently a godlike entity after being killed, to change the past again into one where he has the strength to slaughter the people he loves for the sake of nationalist ideals. This entire arrangement is very blatantly just projection, like almost every single detail is directly reflective of plot chad ideology. They are upset that Eren valued his friends' lives over the island's long-term safety, so they concoct fanfiction where he changes his mind about that. They hated the real ending and wanted their very specific ending instead, so they make up a bunch of world building that would allow their ending to still happen. And what's important to remember here is that Attack on Titan is already a time travel show. You'd think this would lend credibility to the theory, but in reality it goes against it, because Attack on Titan is very explicitly a closed time loop. Eren attains ultimate power and manipulates the past, but not to change the present. Him changing the past is what allowed the present to happen in the first place in a sort of circular way. It's all very confusing, and we don't need to know the details because all you need to know is that it directly contradicts their theory for AoE. Now, Titan magic has contradictions and inconsistencies in it as is. It's not this super coherent thing, and it's constructed mostly out of symbolism, plot necessity, and emotion. So all the plot chads need is a series of convoluted theories convincing them that there is enough symbolism, plot necessity, and emotion behind AoE for it to override established canon. Enter r/ANRMA. It is a subreddit dedicated to people trying to convince themselves that AoE is going to happen. This consists of a pretty predictable Mott and Bailey. It goes between finding evidence that the ending will have adaptational changes, and then using that as a jumping off point for speculation that said changes will turn the ending into ANR. And it got a lot of work done, not in doing any actual intellectual work, but instead by severing what ties its users still had to reality. Like, how do you go from the manga ending in early 2021 in a way which completely contradicts their reading of the story, to them, in early 2023, seeing a fairly straightforward trailer for what looks like a direct adaptation and cheering in victory because this means they won? How can you do that to someone? Till now, I've referred to these people as plot chads because that was the name of the movement, but what sprouted up in ANRMA was something else entirely. It was far more unhinged. Plot chads were saying stupid stuff, yeah, but it was at least stupid in familiar ways. It was clearly driven by mundane cognitive biases like ego, overconfidence, groupthink, and political allegiance. However, if you take a plot chat and force them to accept they were wrong, some will, but a lot will choose to completely untether themselves from reality rather than suffer that emotional blow, which is when things just get weird. Enter the Hope Chads and the Doomer Chads. These are the two types of ANRMA users. The Doomer Chads believe ANR was planned but then averted due to Isayama being convinced, bribed, or coerced into changing the ending. The Hope Chads think that ANR didn't happen yet because it will happen in the future as part of AoE. It's tempting to say that the Doomer Chads are the more reasonable group, but in reality both use logic which is ridiculous beyond salvaging. They are two different punchlines to the same bad joke. So, what kind of evidence did the Hope Chads come up with? Well, for starters, AoE is really clever as a coping mechanism because it lends itself to taking the tiniest crumbs of evidence, giant air quotes on that, and making mountains of them. This is because any continuity error or similar inconsistency in the story can be an indication of multiple timelines. This is very well documented in the response to this scene. It's a remake of a scene which has been depicted a number of times because it's more or less the first scene in the story. Now, in the actual text of the story, here's what's happening. Eren, at the start of the manga, wakes up after having a dream where Mikasa tells him, "See you later, Eren." It is revealed at the end of the story that this was him receiving a memory from the future. The moment he was seeing was the ending of the penultimate chapter, where Mikasa says this line after killing him. So, yeah, it makes sense what Isayama is doing here. Mikasa killing Eren is a dramatic, ironic twist of fate and the planned climax of the story from day one. Isayama hinted at it in Chapter 1 because while the precise details of the finale were in flux, he always knew Eren would become a villain and then Mikasa would kill him. A twist so sensible and realistic for the story that people were predicting it long before we even learned about the nature of the outside world. It's a plot twist without much to ponder on in terms of lore. We don't know precisely by what mechanisms this occurred, but its purpose in the story is so straightforward, so tropey, that very few people look at it and see a coded message. But the Hope Chads are a different breed. By pointing out continuity errors and other discrepancies arising from this being adapted from multiple different parts of the manga written years apart, they conclude that this footage clearly shows scenes from different timelines. In the eyes of the Hope Chad, these tiny, literally inconsequential details in how they chose to animate this scene were not just evidence, but proof that their theory was correct. Even within the context of this scene, though, there is even more insane stuff they do. This scene here is shown in the same trailer as this scene here. The first is set at the beginning of the story, with Eren wearing a red hoodie, and the latter is set near the end, with him wearing a black hoodie. Now, if we're looking at this with an unsullied mind, it's obvious why the hoodies are different colors. because they take place at different times. The child Aaron in the future is wearing the same outfit as future Aaron in the final arc. This lines up with the otherwise still obvious interpretation that this child Aaron is not the result of time travel, but is, in fact, just future Aaron being depicted symbolically as still being childish and immature, because, that was the point of the scene, to depict Aaron's motivations that way. But the plot chads back in the day already cooked up the idea that this Aaron here wasn't future Aaron, but was instead Chapter 1 Aaron, being carried into the future to see what his future self would do. And the claim is specifically that child Aaron saw into the future in his dream during Chapter 1. To the Hope chads, this interpretation is canonical. So the fact that this child Aaron and that child Aaron are wearing different outfits means that they are from different timelines, because according to the Hope chads, these two moments happen from child Aaron's point of view only minutes apart, so if it was the same timeline, his hoodie should be the same color. But it isn't, which means that it is, in fact, multiple timelines, and why would there ever be multiple timelines if they weren't going to do A&R? I don't know why Aaron is wearing a different hoodie in the anime timeline, especially at the point of divergence. It doesn't make sense. It's not meant to make sense. There was an adaptational change to the anime at the end of the story's second arc, the female Titan arc. The fight scene is changed so that Aaron, after transforming, goes berserk. His eyes go blue, he catches fire, he begins attacking recklessly, and he goes on an internal diatribe about being free and destroying everything. Now, going berserk in the manga of Attack on Titan is not an unheard of thing for Titan shifters, especially new Titan shifters, even if they don't usually catch fire. What a reasonable person would assume is that Aaron just went berserk here because of heightened emotion, that the visual changes are aesthetic flares, and what he says during this is a hint at how he'll eventually do the rumbling. He's always had this destructive impulse within him, and the rumbling is how he gets it out, that sort of idea. To the Hope chats, though, this is proof that the anime timeline is different. Him saying he'll destroy everything is because in this moment he is being influenced by the regrets of manga timeline Aaron, who let some of the world outside the island survive, leading to the island's eventual destruction. They believe this would influence anime timeline Aaron into doing a complete rumbling, rather than letting his allies kill him, which... Okay, we need to talk about that for a second. I should make it clear that Aaron never explicitly lets his allies kill him. He just knew he'd lose the fight and decided to accept it. He had a plan, knew it would fail due to precognition, but wanted to do the plan anyways for emotional reasons, and him knowing that his friends would survive at the end, and would even be more likely to survive than if he didn't do it, is in fact one of the reasons he was letting himself do such an atrocity. There isn't really a point in the final fight where he tries to lose, where he just lets his allies beat up on him. The only explicit act of self-sabotage clearly written into the story was by not using his power over all Eldians to wipe his allies' memories, because he doesn't want to take away their freedom. But that is, on his part, at most a lie by omission. That is genuinely something he might do, even if he didn't know the future. And I don't think I've seen a single A&R theory that suggests he'd even do that a bit differently in the anime timeline. It is fairly reasonable to say that even if Aaron was characterized differently, we'd have gotten the same ending. This is part of why the Berserk Titan thing is really convenient for the Hope Chads, because they can say that it's a difference maker. Aaron will go Berserk Titan in the final fight, and that will seal the fate of the Cringe Vengers, leading to A&R. Finally. So when a promotional poster depicts Aaron's final form in the anime possessing blue eyes and being covered with flames, they apparently won, because this is proof that Aaron will go berserk. And why would he go berserk if there wasn't an anime original ending? But of course, even if there were changes to the anime and how the fight went down, that would not be proof that A&R was still on the table, because it was never on the table. Adaptational changes are simply one of many as of yet unmet prerequisites for their theories, not evidence of them, but that's close enough for the Hope Chads. There is a very memorable panel that shows Aaron's head in the mouth of the final boss Titan with his eyes closed. A similar shot is shown in a trailer, but Aaron has his eyes open. It's a difference between the manga and the anime, and hey, Aaron in the manga had his eyes closed, but in the anime he has his eyes open. That clearly means that, it means whatever they need it to mean. And of course, who could forget this trailer that I mentioned earlier, which depicts Aaron saying a single anime original line so vague that it could mean anything, and so the Hope Chads flatten it as per their protocol. And of course, there's the song Under the Tree, released as part of a promotional campaign for the anime with lyrics from Mikasa's point of view that is so clearly in line with the themes, messages, and narrative conclusions of the final chapters of the manga that it is closer to confirming the absence of an anime original ending than any of their theories have ever gotten to proving it. But they twisted it, flattened it, and some of them even convinced themselves that part of the more romantic moments from the song were from Historia's point of view. And don't even get me started on the nonsense, which is green sky theory, cause I haven't even figured out what that's about yet. Some of the wilder theories have been compiled quite helpfully within a Reddit post called the Shinganshina Project, where some of the original theories that started the A&R movement were helpfully summarized and centralized. Writing about these documents has been one of the most difficult parts of the entire video because they're just too insane. Like, when writing about stuff this blatantly self-evident, what plane of existence do you even step foot on to begin talking about it? They are at once impenetrable to understand and trivial to debunk, as complex as they are unimpressive, and that alone makes them interesting and worth dissecting. The first of the 4 documents shows the apparent evidence of the 3 timelines. There are these things that the Hope Chads and a lot of other fans have started referring to as memory shards. Basically, in 2 instances where Titan magic was happening or sort of tangentially involved, we got these flurries of tiny panels showing events that either already happened or will happen. Or in the case of one of these, it's just an Easter egg about the hypothetical high school comedy starring the cast of Attack on Titan that Isayama wrote as a running gag. You may already be picking up on the issues with using this as proof of the existence of multiple timelines within the lore. Now, according to the Hope Chads, these memory shards should follow certain rules. They should either be Aaron's memories of things that happened to him, or Aaron's memories of visions he received back in Chapter 90, which showed him the future. Now, these precognition visions happened in a certain way that is kind of complicated, but all you need to know is that they put restraints around what kinds of ideas and images he could theoretically have bouncing around in his head. And that's more or less the criteria these theorists posit for what must be true about all of these memory shards. They have to be Aaron's memories. Based on these assumptions, they make some truly absurd claims. They claim that since this shot of geese flying was only in the anime adaptation, it's proof of an anime timeline, or at least contact between the anime timeline and the manga timeline. Also, this shot from Chapter 101 was drawn much more like the shot from the anime and less like the actual manga panel. It doesn't really match one-to-one with either, but why wouldn't he just draw it like the manga? It couldn't possibly just be drawn from a different angle, more representative of Aaron's point of view, could it? Also, here's a shot of Historia looking pensive, and the only shot we have that looks exactly like this one is from the anime timeline confirmed. And as if that wasn't enough, this shot of his sleeve in an iconic scene is different from the one shown in the chapter proper, and these 2 moments were a mere chapter apart. Could a genius such as Isayama really make such a basic continuity error, or is it a coded message for us about the existence of multiple timelines? So yeah, all of that is ludicrous on the face of it, but it's also ignoring the fact that their assumptions that these memory shards all had to be Aaron's memories is just factually incorrect. We were given no guide on how to read these. No one even told these guys to call them memory shards. They just made up rules, noticed that the manga wasn't following those rules in a way you'd expect, and then decided something was amiss. But all of that is ignoring the much bigger problem that all of this was just an artistic choice. The phrase artistic choice is something that the Plot Chads and Hope Chads have been bandying about sarcastically to mock their critics. To them, when someone claims that the parallels between Amir and Historia were just an artistic choice, what the Plot Chads and Hope Chads think those guys are saying is that there is no meaning behind these parallels and that Isayama just did it on a lark and that there's no reason to analyze it. But what these people are really trying to communicate when they claim something is an artistic choice is that it's not a coded message. Sometimes someone just includes a parallel between 2 characters to point out vague, ephemeral similarities that are not indicative of future plot developments. Sometimes people do it as a way to make the story more gooder, as an artistic choice. They're saying Isayama wasn't laying out some grand conspiracy for them to uncover. Maybe, just maybe, Isayama wanted to put a whole bunch of small snippets of scenes that he felt were emotionally relevant to the current chapter in order to set the scene. Maybe he was on a tight schedule to get the chapter out the door, so once he came up with that evocative idea, he just executed it without realizing a bunch of cranks were going to try and squeeze every last bit of potential meaning and world building out of it well after the manga ended. Maybe he had bigger things on his mind, such as making the story enjoyable, than making sure every individual dream sequence was perfectly consistent with the asinine set of rules that came from a bunch of future Redditors with too much free time trying to create a codified set of rules for a soft magic system. Believe it or not, all of that was actually fairly grounded by the standards of the Shiganshina project. The next theory, black background theory, is pure stand-up. See, typically in manga, panels exist in this white void, the color of the paper they're printed on, but sometimes Isayama likes to paint in those filler sections black. Now, almost all of these are either flashbacks or dream sequences, so the purpose of this, say it with me now, artistic choice, is pretty clear. It's to emphasize that this is in someone's mind or memory. It's just a visual flair. But plot chads have a different idea. I mean, not every flashback is in black, right? So there has to be something unique about these scenes specifically. And what did they come up with? Well, all of these black border scenes involve contact with the anime timeline. So, this is going to be complicated, because it doesn't make sense. It's all working backwards. Take this scene that they say is from the anime timeline. Eren is stressing over visions he got of the future, over the fact that he'll commit genocide. He says a line saying that they must have not found a way to save parity. Now, if you're reading this normally, it's clear what he means by this. He's saying, I saw a future where I kill everyone. I would not do that if there was a way of ending this war via diplomacy. What the Hope Chads read, though, is, it turns out that in the manga timeline, parity still gets destroyed. They aren't discovering anything. They aren't looking at lines that don't quite make sense and figure out their secrets. They're just writing fan fiction. Every part of black background theory is like this, but I want to share 3 of my favorites. First is this scene with Jean. It starts with Jean siding with the Jaegers, but he is convinced to join the Cringevengers when Hanji appeals to his sense of morality. The Hope Chad who wrote this feels that this doesn't make any sense, because Hanji didn't properly address the Jaegers' position, and that, as a result, it only makes sense that some weird timeline stuff happened, where Jean, from the anime timeline, is on the side of the Jaegerists, while the Jean in the white background is with the Alliance because he's from the manga timeline. There is also this 10 out of 10 analysis of a flashback involving Hanji and an injured Levi. They point out moments where white bars separate the panels and how there are continuity errors between these panels. Their positions and outfits change. Suddenly, Levi has bandages when he didn't used to. Clearly, timelines were switched. My brother in Christ. Those are jump cuts. Time elapsed. Finally, we have one of the weirdest parts of black background theory. The very first chapter starts even before the see you later Eren scene, with everyone looking up in awe at the colossal titan, with a black background. And of course, they conclude that this must be the anime timeline, which means that these guys need to believe that the 3 timelines thing was planned from chapter 1. The third theory in the Shiganshina project is just mind-blowing levels of cope. It is claiming that chapters 120 through 121, where Eren does his wild time loop gambit to ensure he obtains ultimate power, did not take place after chapter 119, despite every aspect of the visual storytelling indicating this, and the story making perfect sense if you assume as such. It instead posits that this takes place at the end of the manga, with the absolutely brilliant line, Chapter 120, which we know is after the manga. The entire thing is just mindless fan fiction about what they think went down after the ending of the manga that got Eren to make the anime timeline. Words like confirm and know are lobbed about willy-nilly while they make absolutely ridiculous claims, like how Flock mentioned parody becoming a sea of blood, and how that's a reference to this shot that was made in 2013 for the first episode of the anime, and how that's confirmation that Eren was seeing into the future of the manga timeline where Flock was proven right. And in general, they cite the assumed existence of 3 timelines as much, if not more, than the actual content of the text, with lines like, when you stop to ask the question, why could manga Eren only see up until his death? It at first doesn't make sense, considering he supposedly had future memories of the anime timeline, specifically describing not how their theory contradicts something said in the manga, but how the manga contradicts with their theory. Disappointingly, the last part of the big project isn't nearly as flashy or interesting, it's just sad. It's a lot of Cope trying to convince themselves that the last few chapters were hinting at an anime original ending. It's partly a genuinely alright reading of some world building, partly a rant about how they disagree with Isayama's choice to have characterized a character as having had Stockholm Syndrome, and partly a pathetic rant about how their version of the ending where Eren and Historia have a baby who turns out to be the reincarnation of the immortal child who makes Titan magic work would be a better ending for her than her just moving on once the Titan curse ended. There are a lot of theories I didn't go over. No small number of them are about analyzing other works that are kind of sort of like A&R that they think may have inspired AOT, and so they think it'll inspire more of it. Muv-Luv, Revo's musicals, the life of real-world painter Van Gogh. Revo, the person who made the song Akatsuki no Requiem, whose music video people lost it over, is widely considered by them to be on their side, despite the complete lack of evidence that he agrees with any of this. It goes to the point where they don't just read everything he does as coded messaging, but see his very presence as evidence that things should be read that way. This is A&RMA. This is what they believed. So let's take a step back here for a moment. We've talked a lot about a version of Attack on Titan which was all but entirely fabricated from the minds of conspiratorial cranks. We're getting close to our discussion of how the anime actually ended, so let's, for a moment, take a look at the manga ending with a bit of an objective lens. As I've stated before, Attack on Titan is defined by a lot of wishy-washiness. As I've demonstrated and explained earlier, the story is fixated not on statements of what ought to be done, but instead on uncertainty. It loves putting its heroes into no-win scenarios, not letting them achieve things without getting their hands dirty and making sacrifices. The story is something of a lament. To put it crudely, it's drinking vodka straight from the bottle while sobbing about how the world just isn't fair. In spite of this, there is a hope associated with Attack on Titan. In moments like the Children of the Forest monologue, the story does feel like it comes out to say something. While the story laments that it can be impossible to know how to make the world a better place, it does seem to think that we should try anyways. That is the core of Attack on Titan, the belief that the world should be made a better place, that there is beauty in the world worth fighting for so that it can be preserved, but also a morbid fascination with how we as a species don't really know how to do that. Oh, it gives the easy answers other stories often do, stop the genocide, try not to be racist, but it then says those platitudes don't just change everything. The wishy-washiness of the story, its insistence to not find a solution, follows through to the characterization a lot of the time. Characters in AOT don't really progress in a steady, linear way all of the time. A lot of them are like a pendulum, going back and forth between two ideas and grappling with the tension between them. Armin, for example, has to decide between accomplishing his goals by being cruel and his desire to find more idealistic solutions. He bounces back and forth between them the entire manga. Mikasa had to struggle between holding onto her feelings for Eren, all of the positive memories he gave her, who made her what she is today, and throwing them away because they are holding her back. In the end, she chooses both, wrapping the scarf Eren gave her as a kid around her neck before going in to land the final blow against him. Attack on Titan's ending sounds insane to a lot of people, with none of the problems really being solved and everyone kind of ending up where they already were, but that's just what Attack on Titan is. It's about uncertainty and a lack of true resolution, about holding on to hope in spite of that. Everything about it, from Eren being uncertain about his deeper motivations, to the fact that war continues, to the fact that Mikasa doesn't fully throw Eren away, to the fact that we don't know what happens when they get off the boat and try to parlay with the Jaegerists, all of it is following through on the themes of the story, the things which made AOT what it is. You can critique those things, but you can't say that the ending doesn't fit the manga that came before it. It is an ending that only this manga could have done and gotten away with. Lots of fans hated it, but most fans really liked it. It had a lot of flaws, but it was so fitting for the story that most fans considered it a fitting conclusion, and it was fairly well received. That might sound unbelievable, but if you can stick through a story like this till the end, there's a pretty good chance you're fine with uncertainty as an ending. The ironic thing here is that, in essence, this is what the plot Chad said they wanted. It was a daring, kind of edgy ending with bittersweet elements that was unlike any other ending, or at least most other endings, and that only people who were paying attention to the story would really be able to appreciate it, with everyone else being confused. But the thing is, they thought that they, the small minority, were the people who understood the manga while everyone else didn't. In reality, reading a dense, complex manga and getting the point isn't nearly as hard as they wanted it to be. Getting it doesn't make you special, which is what they wanted, to be special. What really assisted this ending is the same thing that arguably let Isayama get away with a story so severely shoved up its own ass, and that's because he's a really smart and effective writer. The ending is full of well-thought-out monologues which give interesting, contextually important thematic ideas that drive things forward while adding to the thematic content of the story overall. The huge action set piece is being made by someone who, while admittedly burnt out and rushing things, really knows how to make a dramatic, emotional, and thrilling action sequence. And for how oddly rushed it was, for how many things were dropped or kind of unearned, he tied it together in a way that was deeply compelling in its structure. It was exciting, gripping, full of stuff that reminded people why they loved the story, and ended in a way that was fairly daring while staying true to the heart of the story. There are legitimate reasons to dislike it, but it was, for the most part, a pretty damn good ending and was well received. I think that's a pretty fair thing to say. Let's compare that to what the plot chads wanted. They wanted A&R, an ending where Eren wins. They've been working on a fan comic that depicts this very thing, and while it isn't finished, it's a pretty good test run of their ideas. Like many tryhards before them, the people who wrote this admired stories like Attack on Titan in part because of their dramatic, thematic dialogue scenes, and they want to write something like that, but their problem is that they have nothing to work with. They flattened the story so much that every idea they have is completely stagnant, just a copy of something earlier. Every dramatic thing someone says, with few exceptions, is echoing something they or someone else said earlier in the manga. There isn't much new stuff to add, but they want to write a smart, exciting scene, so they drag it out as the characters chew the scenery and say the arc words. It is full of fan service, padded out, doesn't add much, and ignores a ton of the setup the story spent a lot of time on. It is everything the plot chads tell themselves the manga ending was. The ending idea also isn't original. Every person who read Attack on Titan or even just heard about the plot thought about the idea of an everyone dies ending. It's not remotely original, but it is daring, but not for any interesting reasons. It would be pure shock value. And there's nothing wrong with making shock value art or art that works for shallow reasons, but that is what this would be, and they can't admit that. High-concept art is not inherently better than art that works on less complicated axes. We should be totally clear about that. The complexity or obtuseness of a work of art, while it can provide value, does not on its own inform how genuine or valuable of an emotional experience the art can provide. I may appreciate Attack on Titan for its complexity, but that isn't an excuse to be an art snob. What is mind-boggling about the plot chads is that they want to be art snobs. Like, they aspire to be people who are obnoxious about art. But they don't know enough about art. They aren't good enough at analyzing it to even accomplish that. They want A&R, the ending they want for dumb and bad reasons, to be high-class, hyper-intellectual art. So they have to convince themselves that basic stuff like shock value is intelligent and maverick by virtue of being transgressive. It would certainly be an evocative ending, maybe even a memorable one, but it certainly would not be high art. It would not be a fitting ending to the manga that came before it, and I don't know if I'd even describe it as good. What it would succeed at being is an excuse for the plot chads to feel superior, to be the ones who really understand, to be the intellectuals in the room. They made a theory, and they don't want to be wrong about it, 'cause that would be embarrassing. But what the Hope Chads want is on another level. The story the plot chads wanted was juvenile and try-hard, but it would at least follow basic storytelling conventions. The AoE stuff is just bizarre. The story they want is one of subterfuge and red herrings that break well past the point of absurdity, locking true understanding of the story and why it works behind a truly arcane amount of theory crafting and decoding. There is a theory that analyzed the promotional material for the finale, which based itself on asking why certain information wasn't blurred, and instead of the obvious answer, they forgot, they assume it was a puzzle for them to decode. The Hope Chads want Attack on Titan to be about puzzles, hidden clues, and rewarding the people who pay attention and wildly theorycraft. They think that all of their decoding is them finding evidence of what would be independently a great ending, but A&R, as it is, would be an ending that panders to a small minority. The monstrosity that Hope Chads are suggesting is to do the same thing, but after literal years of irrelevant and superfluous subterfuge. There is no world where this would be comprehensible and sensible to normal viewers. If they got everything they wanted, it's easy to think that it would at least, be original, but no, not really. In their ideal world, Attack on Titan becomes a really, really bad alternate reality game. This is important. This cannot go unsaid. There are already stories that exist for people like this. People who want to make wild theories and decode social media posts can just play myhouse.wat or watch Petscop, but they want those skills to be transferable to understanding and predicting the ending of an action anime that spends half of its time pontificating on ethics. They are lost without a map. If they got what they wanted, the end result would be absolute garbage. It would be a demonstrable failure at doing what it set out to do. If it was doing what they say it is, and it was doing it well, most of the fandom would be having fun theorizing. If the core of the story is about understanding these weird esoteric patterns, the story did an awful job of teaching us to even look for them. The story they want sucks. And they know that. They know that it doesn't work for most people. They know it does a terrible job of leading people to uncover things. They want to be so smart that they can get past the fact that only the most ridiculously dedicated people could even hope to understand any of this, because that boosts up their ego. Okay, real quick, before we move on. Normally I plug my stuff at the end of my videos, but there really isn't a good point to do that before we cap things off, not one that feels appropriate, so I'm just gonna do my spiel here. This thing was a ton of work to make, and I really love making stuff like this. If you guys are enjoying this, then please share it with other people, like it, and leave a comment to help with analytics, and also subscribe. I make videos on the quality of anime mostly, but I do try to tackle everything with the level of analysis you see here. So if you enjoyed this, you'll probably enjoy my other content. I personally recommend my video on an anime that I call Second Time Isekai. I really like that video. I wouldn't have been able to dedicate all of this time to making this without my patrons, so I wanted to give them a shout out right now, especially Bellman, Carolyn Vig, and Love Your Content. And of course, I'd like to implore you to click the link in the description to go check out my Patreon. Anyways, on with the video. We are about to reach the climax of our story, but there are some things that I want to discuss first, things which are very tricky to properly describe. I've left them either implied or brushed past up until now because my hope was that with enough exposure to the plot chads and hope chads, you'd start to pick up on them and that would make it easier to explain. The first is a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept of theming. I'm pretty sure I've discussed theming on this channel before, but let's go over it quickly just in case. Theming is the process of making all of the parts of your story fit together, so to speak. If you have a story where the protagonist is forced to interact with the loss of a loved one, you are going to need to make a protagonist that is interesting when they grapple with the loss of a loved one. You're going to then want to give them a lot of loved ones to lose and put them in situations where loss takes place because that's where they're interesting. Because so many plot beats involve the concept of loss, you're going to want to fill those scenes with other characters who are also interesting when they are dealing with loss, and now loss is a theme of your story. If you think of your story as a series of pegs and holes, then theming is the process of making sure those pegs and holes are all the same few shapes, making sure the same broad ideas and themes are brought up again and again so that you can build your story around them. And Attack on Titan is very thorough with this process. Ideas and symbols like freedom, birds, sacrifice, violence, and the sea are all brought up all over the place in every way you can imagine. The end result is a story where you can form seemingly meaningful connections between pretty much any two scenes. These connections are not pure happenstance, but not every single connection you might find was specifically planned out. The process of theming, especially in a story as long and dense as Attack on Titan, is one of controlled chaos. It's a means of automating the creation of interesting connections. This is something the plot chads, and especially the hope chads, just haven't really pieced together yet. Like, they think that when a story about the cycle of violence mentions the cycle of violence in two different scenes, that those scenes were made with one another in mind. They have a very high school English class idea of what a theme or a parallel even is, of what role it has in the story, and this is part of why they can't achieve their dream of being art snobs. They just haven't wrapped their head around the basics of the medium. This leads into a more overarching problem, which is a failure to understand the concepts of truth and logic. In reality, the world we all inhabit, truth is kind of a fickle, vague, philosophical concept. It's more of a value judgment than an objective quality. For example, something can be technically true, but deeply unhelpful. Something can be a lie by omission, and what counts as omission is often subjective. Quantum mechanics and general relativity contradict each other, but are both, by all scientific standards, true. Truth is a weird thing that is hard to pin down. Society chugs on anyway, though. We still use the word truth and refer to facts. When we say it, we're saying something is true for all intents and purposes. It is not absolute truth that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, but it is close enough to being absolute truth that we feel comfortable using the word true. It is a value judgment that something is good enough, that it is secure, reliable, and worthy of respect as a quote-unquote fact. What you need to understand about the plot chads and hope chads is that when they are talking about truth, they are using that word in a very emotional way. They are talking about experiencing truth. When you learn that the boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius, you experience a fact. You experience the acquisition of knowledge pertaining to reality. What would be very silly to do is to assume that, since you felt the experience of learning a fact, to assume that what you learned must be a fact, that it must be absolute reality. It would be very ridiculous to, upon learning that sometimes water boils at different temperatures based on things like atmospheric pressure, denounce this new knowledge as fake, because, as we all know, water boils at 100 degrees. Insisting otherwise is denying basic reality. If you are a transgender individual, you are very familiar with this logical fallacy. This is, basically, what the plot chads and hope chads were doing. They read into things way too much and fell prey to a bunch of basic cognitive biases, leading to them concluding that Historia's baby daddy is Eren. They therefore conclude that Isayama must, at some point, confirm this fact. When the manga never wound up confirming that Eren is the father and all but confirmed that he wasn't, they didn't reassess their conclusions nor the methods they used to reach them. They've already filed away Eren being the daddy as a fact, so whatever needs to be true for their previous conclusion to not be debunked in the light of new information must also be true. Isayama must have chickened out and changed the plan. Debunking the narrative only fuels their belief in a conspiracy, because a world where everything they already believed to be true continues to be true, but where they also seemingly get disproven, must be an irrationally complex one with bad actors doing things behind the scenes. This is why we have logic and rationality. Rationality is not, as many people believe, a character trait. It is not a quality of one's mind. The entire point of it is that it is a set of rules that exist outside of our minds, so that we can check our minds against it. When we reason things out in our heads, we will always get things wrong, but the plot chads and hope chads have, to put it very crudely, a dumb person's idea of intelligence. When they read black background theory and don't notice the gaping holes in it, they experience a lack of holes. In their mind, they have discovered a lack of holes, deduced a lack of holes, and concluded its validity. That process is what they assume smart people do to arrive at truth. So, black background theory is strong. Black background theory is Isayama giving us hints. Black background theory makes the final chapter make sense. The final chapter already makes sense. Even the really questionable parts are things you can make sense of. It's not hard to deduce what Isayama was going for, or at least, it's not hard to come up with ideas of what he was going for. However, they had already created a false conception of Isayama in their mind. They know for a fact that Isayama intended for A&R, and that he meant for everyone to read the story the way they did. They proclaim that to be the truth because they emotionally need it to be the truth. Calling it true is comforting. It means they don't need to reassess themselves. The root of conspiratorial thinking is being willing to reassess only that which is comfortable to reassess. This is one of the things that really bothers me about how a lot of people discuss the plot chads, and especially the hope chads. There's this sense that they are annoying but benign, but that's not really a good read on things. All of the fluff taken away, this is a community which encourages people to abandon critical thinking by rewarding them with social attention. It is deeply unhealthy and has negative effects on people's lives. When someone is this capable of accepting complete nonsense in order to avoid reassessing themselves and growing as a person, that doesn't suddenly end when they step away from the computer and start interacting with other people, and it doesn't end with anime. Like a wise man once said, if a guy tells you he thinks the earth is flat, don't ask him about the Jews. I don't mean to say that everyone in A&R is an anti-Semite, but this is the personality matrix required in order to believe in conspiracy theories. No matter how this ends, this is a situation with no winners. The finale of Attack on Titan came out on November 4th, and materially, here is what it consisted of. The ending was a more or less scene-for-scene recreation of the last 5 chapters, with basic adaptational changes like adding more detail to action sequences and changing the order of some scenes to account for the lack of chapter breaks. Additionally, some minor changes were made to the script to address complaints with the final battle, such as this subplot between the Eldian rebels and the remnants of the Marley military. Originally, they got past their differences and joined forces so that they could fight against Eren together only to contribute nothing. But in the anime, they work together to tend to the wounded, which keeps them from feeling like their subplot was useless and lacking in conclusion. Them teaming up accomplishes something that wasn't plot critical, but something. The major differences come from one particular scene, a scene which was heavily criticized in the manga, where Armin talks with Eren about what happened. It's a dream sequence that caps off the story. A lot of it is retained with few alterations, but the very ending was replaced. Initially, in an attempt to comfort Eren in his final moments, Armin tries to find the good in what Eren is doing, to talk to his childhood friend at the center of this. At the end of the day, you did this for us, so thank you. This was obviously kind of yikes. It's not hard to see the emotional concept that Isayama was getting at, but as is, it was rushed and easily interpreted as apologia. This section was replaced with a very long addition to the scene, which added a lot. It had a proper argument between Armin and Eren about what Eren was doing, which was a lot less sketchy and more appropriately got to the emotions Isayama wanted to convey. It also lent a lot of clarity to Eren's character. The end conclusion is much like I suggested earlier in the video. Eren did what he did for emotional reasons. This is the result of giving a normal idiot like him absolute power. With most of the petty issues addressed, the biggest problem seen almost completely redone in a way that most people found moving and well written, and all of the stuff people liked being adapted to a great degree of execution, the ending was widely considered to be incredible by manga veterans and first-time viewers alike. Something the plot chads were terribly confused by since they assumed their opinion was the majority and thought everyone would hate it. r/Titanfolk is nowadays the resting place for most Jaegerbomb refugees, and here we can see what they think of both the ending and the fan reaction to the ending. It really highlights their complete inability to comprehend the story. There is an overwhelming air of indignant confusion. Much snarky disgust is raised while comparing Eren in the finale to Eren at some previous time when he was cooler. Like, they'll show Eren saying one thing, and then at a later point, he says a different thing, or even just looks comparably pathetic. Like, okay, there's this one moment where he talks about how he has to keep moving forward to see what is on the other side of hell, and all the plot chads constantly cream their pants over this line. They think it's the coolest, most inspirational stuff ever, but then, later, after pushing on despite his doubts, Eren wound up with regrets and ponders on them, realizing he was a fool. Then there's the detail of the weird time loop stuff. We knew since chapter 121 that Eren, upon obtaining ultimate power, manipulated the past to ensure the security of the time loop. His future self is responsible for his own past self's origin story, and in the finale we learned that that includes Eren inducing the past death of his own mother, a fact which fills him with regret, remorse, and guilt. People compared this to, what if Batman learned he's the one who killed his own parents, and that's like, so off the mark? These guys think Eren was cool. They looked up to him, thought he was aspirational. Every time he gave some dramatic speech about moving forward, they never took it as a villain speech. They took it as the protagonist saying righteous things. So yeah, they're obviously upset when the story goes around and criticizes Eren for his philosophy. The story ends with Eren saying he was wrong, and they thought he was right, so they don't like it. But they're acting like it came out of left field when the entire back half of the story was dedicated to making sure Eren seemed villainous, and so it just kind of comes off like they weren't paying attention. In Chapter 88, a character named Eren Kruger gives a speech about not giving up the fight for Eldia so that the sins they committed in its name won't be for nothing. This was depicted as moving, but in Chapter 121, a similar speech was given by Eren Yeager while he was manipulating the past, and it's meant to seem a lot darker. Clearly, the story is trying to call into question these ideas and their ethical validity. The ideas shared in these two speeches were once shown positively, but oh my god, then they were shown negatively. Storytelling! But the way the plot chads talk about this scene, it's as if they don't realize it's meant to be read as a villain monologue. It's as if they think it's a cool, edgy thing our cool, edgy hero is saying because he's cool and edgy. Like, they enjoy that it's dark and morally dubious because that makes it complex, but they never stop to ponder on what that complexity means for the narrative. It never clicked that the complexity was the story critiquing Eren, saying that Eren might be in the wrong and maybe needs to be stopped. So when it comes around to the finale and Eren goes, oh my god, what have I done? Like, it's one thing to say that you disagree with a choice, but what here are you so confused by? Yes, Eren being responsible for his own tragic backstory does make his entire quest for revenge seem fruitless and empty. That's the point. The story has been trying to hammer that nail in for a while now at this point. It's abstract and weird, sure, maybe worth a film theory video, but this is not inexplicable. Yes, you are right. He isn't comparable to Lelouch. The person who pulled off a plan kind of like this, and then was supposed to be seen as heroic for it, did, in fact, come off as more heroic than the character that the author wanted to criticize. What point do you even think you are making? It's just rage at this point. They wanted a story that was as edgy and immature as them. They wanted an old grudge between Levi and the child soldier who went through a redemption arc to flare up so Levi could kill her. They described the people who liked the story as blissfully ignorant. Oh, how these plot chads long to have not been so good at reading that they could tell how it got ruined. It's just a tantrum. The Hope chads fared a bit better. A lot of them just took the hit on the chin and thanked everyone for how fun the theories were. They did indeed seem to be having more fun. Lots of people still complained, but as time went on, the conspiracy theorists started to beg. This is, somehow, still not the end. Have you considered Eren's balls theory? There is an episodic release of the finale, where it is split up into 20-minute episodes, starting from the 19th, and they think that that will be AoE. But there's also the bonus manga chapter in May, and the Blu-ray release. We will win! All the time, they discuss the idea of anime original ending as winning, like it would be a victory. The literal meaning of this is understandable. They think they will be vindicated for things that other people said they were ridiculous for, but they really do treat it like a battle. What becomes apparent through this rhetoric of victory is a strong sense of ego that has been put into this project. It's obvious that half of these people wouldn't be here if AoE was even remotely likely. In fact, anime original ending, the surprise ANR, is so out there, so unlikely, that to have predicted it reveals a kind of hyperintelligence. Imagine how good it will feel to make this prediction and be right about it, to have pieced together everything and be proven victorious. They are a bunch of people betting on the horse with a limp, and then coming up with theories as to how the limp will give it an advantage. And at this point, I'm just kind of repeating myself, because honestly, what else is there to do? These people aren't complex. The mess they made sure is, but they themselves are pretty repetitive. The plot chads have a childlike grasp on media analysis and spend their days acting like they are the only ones who know what they're talking about. The hope chads will always find a way to hold on to hope and will always make another ridiculous conspiracy theory. I hope, though, that through this, we all can have at least learned something. I wanted to end the video there, but there's something else. There's a topic I've tried and failed to write about this entire video. I've scrapped multiple sections trying to get at this, because, you see, there is another baffling contradiction in this story that is so hard to put into words. Attack on Titan is a story that is fundamentally about emotions. Isayama pulled from real-world conflicts to create sensational and, frankly, kind of insensitive concepts for fantasy war scenarios, and used that as a jumping-off point for character studies, mind-bending what-if ethical scenarios meant to drive character development, and, of course, action sequences. There's no way of describing the story's general plot that doesn't come off as either fascist propaganda or Pocahontas with flesh mechs, and I am painfully aware that my initial summary of the story did not avoid this, but an important distinction to make is what things were dwelled on. Sure, the story exploitatively plays with the fear of retribution, the idea that we should be wary of minority groups and the desire for revenge against the majority, and that is a valid point of criticism, but the story isn't really about how we should be afraid of minorities, or even about how all sides are equally in the wrong. It just uses tropes associated with stories that are about those things as the clunkiest jumping off point imaginable to arrive at much more defensible discussions. This is not to say that the story is flawless and shouldn't be criticized, but this should lend some understanding as to how so many people are able to find the story as palatable as they do, something which can seem wild from the outside, especially if you were coming at this from the perspective that the story is wildly fascist in its themes. And I think the fact that so many of the broad strokes and flashy ideas could be read as far-right and ultra-nationalist from the right angle is a big reason so many people with ultra-nationalist sensibilities found themselves drawn to the story, why so many plot chads were blatantly or implicitly sympathetic to fascism. But what needs to be understood is this contradiction. The plot chads and the fascier hope chads claim this is their favorite story, that they love everything that came before the ending, and that they just wanted to see such an amazing story reach a proper conclusion. But they hate the story. They despise it. They cannot bear to look at it, so they flatten it into something more palatable. Oh, I'm sure they all appreciate all of Isayama's brilliant rises and falls in tension, his great character writing and thrilling action, but when it comes to what the story stands for, they hate Attack on Titan. They are obsessed with the notion of doing what has to be done, but the most iconic moment in the entire series is a monologue about how it's impossible to know what actually has to be done. They cannot bear to accept that for what it is, so they flatten it. They twist it to have the opposite of its actual meaning, and then claim it's one of their favorite scenes. It is a willful, spiteful denial of everything the story stands for. They convince themselves it is only the opinion of the people who don't get it, the ending defenders, the moralist cringe Venger supporters. Turning their eyes is the only way they can bear this show. The most ghoulish example of this is without a doubt their treatment of the Children of the Forest monologue. This monologue, in its original context, comes at a point in the story where the conflict between Parody and the mainland has gotten children wrapped up in it. A brainwashed child soldier from the other side of the ocean killed a beloved supporting cast member and is looking up at the looming figures of all the people who held that woman dear to them. The perspective of her on the ground looking up almost makes them look like titans. The father of the woman she killed goes on one of the most memorable speeches in the story. He talks about how his daughter grew up in the forest, where it was kill or be killed. So he sent her to the city, hoping she'd have a better life. But the whole world is a giant forest, where it is still kill or be killed. He places the blame of her death not on Gabi, the girl who fired the gun that dealt the killing blow, but instead on the world itself. His daughter, according to him, died because she spent too much time wandering in the forest, and that it is the job of adults to get children out of the forest. It is a remarkably utopian sentiment, claiming that the enemy that threatens us all is conflict itself, and that if we want to create a world that is safe for our children, then we must find a way to make a world without conflict. A world that isn't a giant kill or be killed forest. It's optimistic, almost naive, and the epitome of that part of the story which expresses hope in the face of absurdity and impossible odds. It is so human, it touches such a deep part of our souls, that it is universally beloved among the fandom. It would be so easy for the plot chads to ignore this idea, like they ignore and dismiss all of the other pleas for idealism in the story, but they can't. Even the plot chads love it. It's too perfect for the moment at hand and too well constructed for it to not have your heart affected by it. But they cannot bear to acknowledge what those emotions mean, so they even flatten their own hearts. The plot chads claim that their ending is the only one that does this monologue justice, because Aaron, killing the entire world, would end the cycle of violence and get children out of the forest. This is not just a random thing one person said, this was widely stated across the entire movement. It is one of their most significant tenets, and we cannot ignore how repulsive that is. To take a sentiment this beautiful and twist it to be about how children must be protected with cataclysmic levels of violence aimed at innocent people. Especially considering recent global events, that kind of ideology must be refuted with all due passion. Going back through Titanfolk and ANRMA, you find all these people who seem perfectly friendly, but mixed in with them you have no shortage of people saying stuff like this. Just this stuff that's so straightforwardly evil, and seeing almost no pushback. Sure, lots of people just liked ANRMA for the theories, but so many of the foundational theories of the movement were based in stuff like how it makes no sense for Jean to be convinced out of supporting genocide. There is a darkness here that I don't feel like I've done proper justice to. A sinister cruelty to everything about this that just makes my skin crawl. The plot chads are the type of people to be all about themes of how you need to hold on to hope against impossible odds, so long as holding on to hope means holding on to cruelty and laughing in the face of idealistic notions such as togetherness and friendship and empathy. When the impossible odds you face are, this enemy seems unstoppable, then yeah, hold on to hope. But if the impossible odds are, peace seems impossible, then peace is impossible. It's time to slaughter the world. And hey, it's for the children, right? Something something surpassing the father, something something barn sags. Now let's see the blood of some people we haven't been trained to empathize with. This video was originally going to be mostly about Jaegerbomb, but they are just the loudest and most concentrated example of the problem. But the problem was, to some extent, ubiquitous across the entire movement, from ANR to AoE. I'm sure that there are plenty of people in this movement who are wonderful people, and that we shouldn't just discount them as evil. I want to believe in people, and I don't want to blame every individual involved, but what happened in the Attack on Titan fandom, taken as a whole, just wasn't okay. It was a problem. Now, I was going to end it there, and I did set Sunday the 26th as the day I had to upload this Hell or High Water, but a patron who saw the first 7 sections of this video brought up something that I really feel like I should address. I've dismissively brought up this in passing, but Attack on Titan really isn't perfect. I focus heavily on a series of criticisms of the story that are widely ridiculous, but I realize now that I may have given off the wrong impression. While reception of the anime is widely positive, that does not mean there are not legitimate critiques to be made even about the anime adaptation, which are worth listening to. And I should warn you all against lumping all criticism of Attack on Titan in with the plot chads. As I glossed over, many things in the story are socio-politically insensitive, so to speak. Now, I have reasons for feeling like these are not indicative of the overall story, but I also have a lot of distance from the topics in question. I, for example, am not Jewish, and so that definitely affects how I interpret all of the genuinely anti-Semitic things in here, like how anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were used as inspiration for backstory, and how Holocaust imagery was used with intense indiscretion. My patron linked me 4 videos which talked about the ending and criticized them. I agreed with some points, disagreed with others, and didn't have time to get to a lot of it. I made this video under the assumption that Attack on Titan was anti-fascist, because I felt that was the majority opinion. It's an opinion I broadly agree with. It made sense for the video and the framing device within it, and it saved a lot of time on the project. I felt that, leaving out the reasonable critics did not impede my ability to talk about the reasonable ones. And frankly, so much of said criticism, both the stuff I agree with and the stuff that I disagree with, are so intensely political, so intensely divisive, that I didn't really feel it was appropriate for a video where I was dunking on a bunch of people that we can all agree suck. That being said, I can totally understand, looking back on this, how the way I might have done that would have been maybe a bit clumsy, how it could have been read as revisionist, or even just been outright accidentally revisionist, and that definitely isn't my intention. I do implore all of you to not lump in all criticism of Attack on Titan's ending you see with the plot chads and the hope chads, because, agree with it or not, a lot of it is coming from a good place, and there are some very legitimate points to be made.